But then she told me about her husband, that he was a champion in karate. So I said, whoa, gee, you make sure that you let me know when he's visiting Berlin.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. The French forces in Berlin were the units of the French armed forces stationed since 1945 until the end of the Cold War in West Berlin, according to the agreements of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. The troops were the French counterparts to the United States Berlin Brigade and the UK's Berlin Infantry Brigade in the city. Philippe was stationed in Berlin between 1972 and 1973. He did not volunteer, he was conscripted and wasn't too happy at first, but started enjoying life outside of the Quartier Napoleon, as it was called, near Tegel airport. His role was in signals intelligence, and during the day he listened to FM radio transmissions of the East German Army as well as the Soviets. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can help me to keep producing these episodes by a small monthly donation via Patreon. You will get the sought-after Cold War Conversations drinks coaster as a thank you, and you bask in the warm glow of knowing that you are helping me to preserve Cold War history. But don't take my word for it. Here's Andrew Hawes, one of our listeners.
Hi, I'm Andrew, and I'm very proud to support Cold War Conversations with a small donation each month, because Ian's put together such a brilliant range of interviews. If you want high power, there's the son of Nikita Khrushchev, there are cross-border romances, old-fashioned spy stories, and the bizarre world of East European football. If you do support the podcast, your wallet will be a tiny bit lighter, but your brain will be very, very thankful.
If you're interested in supporting us financially, just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. So, back to today's episode. I'm delighted to welcome Philippe to our Cold War conversation.
You know, in France, when you graduate with the baccalaureate, it's you are being asked if you want to start now, if you want to go to the university. They give you the deferral, something like this, for 3 years or 4 or 6 years, whatever you do. And the other option also, if you don't want to serve in the real military, then you can go away from France. That was another option. So you had to disappear from the country for 2 years and prove that you were working for an NGO or for some French school in a third world country, preferably. But then you couldn't go to Belgium, let's say, and stay there for 2 years and pretend that you'd get away with that service. But it's I decided to go because I went briefly, registered in the university, realized that, I had no idea of what I wanted to study. And it was a few courses I took were not very inspiring either. So I said I could join. So they gave me a letter, and then I had to be there. I forgot, at the end of the year, and took a train. And then had my haircut before. I just did not want to have it shaved after arriving. So I tried to get some decent type of... that was the thing. In these days, people had long hair. So getting your haircut was, losing a big chunk of who you thought you were, the image.
Yeah. This was early 70s, wasn't it?
That's correct. Yes, it was in 72. And
right.
72, right. And then you had to serve for a year or more, depending on what contract you had. So, but then it was really a year. Now it's totally disappeared from from France. It's all a professional military, for the better, for the worse. But
where did you first have to report to, and what were those first days like in the French army?
that's a funny feeling. You go in. It was freezing. I remember they had some type of big turbine, throwing some heat, and then they gave us all these uniforms and bags and all these stuffs, and then we found ourselves in line waiting in front of the cafeteria, the mess as they call it. And then I remember we just had no idea, didn't know each other, etc. And then all of a sudden I remember that strange anecdote where there was that guy that came in. He was probably a sergeant or a corporal. He started screaming at us. And then I thought he was just kidding, So I burst out laughing, and then he looked at me and he said, "What's your name?" etc. And then I realized that it was not a joke. Like, the guy was not trying to be funny, imitating the the average movie drill sergeant. He was a real asshole the way they were going to be until the end. But it was short, that after about 3-4 days, we just realized where we were. But it became to be fun. We started making friends after a few days. Physical effort was low grade. I expected something much longer marches, longer exercise things, or target practice and stuff like that. But it was, once a week, or long marches were like once every other week. And I really enjoyed these. I could walk for hours. I didn't like carrying the backpack because it was a little heavy. But beside that, people dreaded that. They would sometimes ask us to walk at night, but that was still, it was, I thought that the physical thing was hardly anything.
And did that sergeant that you quickly found didn't have a sense of humor? Did he continue to make your life difficult or not?
No, you see, I was not in that camp for very long. So that was in France, and that was like about a month and a half. Then I went across, that was in eastern France. So I crossed the Rhine by train, and then I was in Landau, which was in the Palatinate, Pfalz, and the Black Forest. And then spent another month there, where I was trained for encoding messages. So it was the cryptology department. So we were essentially trained on different machines. Some were mechanical, so some were with electronics. So that was not, high tech as it is today, but we were trained on one specific machine that was the main machine that I worked with for the year and after, with encoding these FM radios. So essentially, we were listening to radio waves. And military, I don't know how they decided what was military or not, but then we had several frequencies, and I was not doing the listening thing, but then essentially you would get messages that would be typed, and then I would have these machines with the input was clear and the output was encoded, and then someone else, obviously, on the other side. I never knew where it was read, I presume somewhere in France, and then that was decoded with the same, very much like Enigma machine, but more sophisticated, where you had to have the same code, on both sides to be able to read. So that was the job I was trained for when I was.
You were being trained in signals intelligence by the sound of it. So these were, somebody was listening to FM messages from the Warsaw Pact, and then you were encoding those messages in order to be sent back to France for further investigation.
That's right. So these messages obviously were either in Russian, in Polish, or in German. And most of us servicemen were bilingual because they were most of them from Alsace-Lorraine, so they were pretty good at learning or already knew German. Some of them were binationals and spoke fluently one or the others. You couldn't even tell where they were from. Some, the Slavic languages were mostly professionals, except for one guy. But all these messages on FM were in the local language of these Warsaw Pact, and then they would end up on in the morning because I was not working nights. I was just lucky enough to to receive these messages the morning after. So I would just do my 8 hours and send these messages, but it was not very busy. But essentially, what we were doing is looking at what was the normal, what to expect from these Warsaw Pact troops, and what was a normal day and what was unusual, where they were moving, where we did not expect it. So that was just trying to find out, which in the end, I tell you probably later with the unexpected things. There was the war in 1973 with in October with Israel and then Egypt, and then the Russian threatened to send some troops there because I think that Israel was not following the ceasefire or something like this. But then there was that time where we realized that the exchanges on the FM radio, all these military messages were abnormal to a point. And we'll go back to there. But then there was a tremendous amount of messages all of a sudden. So we could tell something was unusual. And that was why we were there, essentially.
Did you have any combat training, or was it just almost straight into, after the basic training, you were put straight into this signals intelligence unit?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and ever after that, it was very little marches, field trips. It was in Berlin, even though it's a pretty big city. We didn't really go out. There was some practice training, for gun stuff, but that was like once every month or every other month. That's a few times. In fact, I met a few Americans or British soldiers while on duty, where they would come by truck, and we would arrive by truck also. And then, when it was their time, then they would come in, and it was a shareable target practice things. But that's the only few times that we really mingled. And we couldn't even really chit chat because of a language barrier.
Was this still in Germany, or was this in Berlin?
Yeah, that was in Berlin. Sorry, that was in Berlin. But it's true. It was all just encoding messages ever after, office work type for the rest of my time. So
when were you posted to Berlin?
So I arrived, I think, in 1972, and then I was happy to be in a big city again. So it would have even in the evening you would have the right to leave, and you had to come back before 10:30, I think. And then weekends, I tended to have them off also. So it was pretty easy going for me. I don't think that the Warsaw Pact guys were busy during weekends either, if I remember. Yeah, it was pretty easy going.
What were your first impressions of Berlin?
Yeah, it was not like being in a small place. So I really enjoyed going in the streets and not being like as in France. When you leave, you have to wear civilian clothes. You're not leaving with your uniform unless you're on some type of mission. But then people didn't pay any attention to you. Like if we were a group of French servicemen in Germany, we were told you'll get these kids that will want to pick a fight. We were told never to accept a fight from these German kids or French kids also. But in Germany, definitely they were trying to pick fight in the evening. And, in Berlin, there was no such thing. I mean, nobody paid any attention to you, whether you were wearing a uniform or not. So it was great. And there was the Kurfürstendamm, which was like the big avenue in West Berlin. It used to be, Unter den Linden before the big center, but then Berlin Mitte. But then Kurfürstendamm was my hangout for a while. And then that's where I met a German woman, in fact, the second week I was there. So I was really lucky. And that was in a movie theater. They were playing Cabaret.
Yeah, the Liza Minnelli film.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it took place in Berlin in the 1920s. So it was very, and then there she was. And I had no idea I was going to stop and watch that movie. So I was asked later, and you were supposed to say if you had a friendship or a girlfriend or whatever, report it. But then I never bothered, of course. But then, I'm the one that started the talk, and I had no idea I was going to be waiting in line. So it was not a setup, of course. But then, later on, I received a letter from her, and then I told her, if you send me a letter, never say Berlin. Because and then she said, are they going to know? I said, just don't put Berlin. But she did put Berlin. And I was asked then, who's that woman? And then trouble started. But on top of that, she was doing business with East Germany. So she was importing the company she worked for, imported materials from East Germany for very low prices. She said, I wonder, unless it's, how do you call these, some illegal, some
black market.
Black market, exactly. But the fact was that she was going to East Berlin at least twice a week. So I thought that if they follow her, then I might be in trouble. And I should have said that I'd met her. But then it looks like they didn't do their homework. I suspect that they just checked where she worked, etc. And then they asked me for, how I met her. And I said, it was definitely not a setup. But then they believed me, but then they never really double checked. And it was, I was disappointed.
Yeah, I'd be surprised because I would have thought somebody who regularly traveled to East Berlin would be an immediate red flag to the French counterintelligence guys.
Yeah, you would have thought so, but they were not, But, again, our department was not like, it was military intelligence. It was nothing to do with civilians. So she was a civilian as far as I knew, or they knew, but then they obviously didn't pursue but it was not unusual that there was a lot of black market between the two countries. Not unusual at all.
East Germany was very much after the hard currency, weren't they? Did she ask you what you did in the French army, or ask you any questions about what you did?
Yeah, and then I just said that I was some type of secretary, that I would just retype letters. I just never. I mentioned by accident, Fernschreiber, the teletypes, by accident one day, and then she repeated that to some friends when we're together with some of her friends. And I said, wow, you should never have said that. I was really upset. But anyways, no, I was not supposed to share anything. And I did not say anything about what I was doing.
When you were posted to Berlin, were you warned about potential honey traps, women trying to befriend you to get information?
No, not really. We were supposed to report any close relationship with some German citizens, but not. They didn't say anything really. And as far as an attack also of the West, we were vaguely told that there was some arms depot. We knew where they were, but there was no plan B. And of course, if there was a plan B, they were not going to tell us. So, especially servicemen, they were not very reliable anyway. So, the impression we had is that there was no real plan B, no plan A or plan B for that matter.
If West Berlin was attacked by the Warsaw Pact, you didn't have any clear orders as to what to do in that situation.
No, nothing clear. I think that what we were told is just to try to play for time. I didn't know what that meant, but we discussed that among ourselves. Were we going to die for West Berlin, and why would they? We all agreed, among servicemen, that the Russians had no interest in Berlin. They tried to blockade it, and then there was some airlift. They were not going to shoot down airlift British or American airplanes because that would have looked really bad. So then in the 70s, 80s, didn't even try to blockade things. And the fact that they would attack Berlin would have been the first city they would take over, and probably didn't give us any chance to just even slow them down or anything like this. But the chance that the Soviet Union would attack, the Warsaw Pact would attack the West, was totally impossible in our mind. Absolutely unlikely. It was all in the mind of the Americans, maybe the British, but from our side, we never perceived the slightest threat from the Soviet bloc.
What was the French sector like? What was in the French sector of Berlin?
Not much. It was much bigger than the French sector in the rest of West Germany, which is very small, close to the French border. But in Berlin, it was the whole near Tegel airport. It was like the north of the city, and it was. I'm not too sure how the checkpoints, the French military checkpoints, were working. Your question was about the French sector itself. There was no way to say you were in a British or American sector. There was only the barracks that were identifying things. And definitely the Americans were overwhelmingly had their airports and radar system listening device. And we were peanuts, we only had little antennas and we were not as serious as they were. Different interests also that were not ours. It has to be clearly understood that the interest of the United States for Frenchmen, let's say there was some tension in Cuba, let's say in the 60s, and then Russian would put pressure on Berlin, but were we going to die for Cuba, for American interest, perceived from a French serviceman, that was also another, obscure thing. So nobody wanted to die in the first place.
So the military installations were around the Quartier Napoleon? Right.
So there was a, small place. There were some, I think it was around 3,000 to 5,000 people, including the wives and children, of the professional soldiers. It was very small barracks, small garrison. It was not very Americans. I think there were a lot more of them. And they had PX also. So we were entitled to go to the American PX with our military papers, and we could buy there. So that was the fun things. We often used to go to Tempelhof Airport, where, among other places that the Americans had, and then buy stuff in their PX and meet some American soldiers there too, even though, there's that small anecdote where we were there, I think it was at 5:00 or something, and then they started putting the Star Spangled Banner on the loudspeakers, and everybody stopped, put their hands on their heart, and we were there, just totally stunned. Like, really, is that? We didn't have much of this. Maybe the British have that too. The God Save the Queen, and but in France, ever after World War II, more pressure was made on being a European, especially reconciliating France and Germany. So the idea of waving a French flag or singing, an anthem to the glory of the French culture was very much like the Germans. Had a very low profile about being German or being a Frenchman. The European Union was being created, and but seeing the American, stop and put their hands on their heart, that was just another world for us.
Yeah. What were your rations like in Berlin? Was it just regular stuff that you would have in France? I remember a British soldier telling me they were very envious of the fact you had wine with your meals.
That's true. Yeah, pretty lousy quality wine, but see, in France and in West Germany, France was paying the bill and doing the cooking, etc. So we in Berlin, the Western Allies were paid by I think probably the federal government, not the city of Berlin. But we had German food, in our mess, or French German, and we had beer and wine. But you could definitely have wine, and you could get 2 bottles or get one, buy one from one of your colleague, and get drunk if you wanted. There was, but the quality of the wine was lousy. It was really low, as bad as it. And we used to get also one cartridge of cigarettes. It's just awful, encouraging young kids to smoke. And but I didn't smoke personally, so I would sell my Gauloise, my cartridge of Gauloise Bleu, and get some other things. I forgot what they were, but otherwise the food was fine. It was not nowhere near what you get when you're in a war zone, or where you have to eat from your how do you call that? These little packages.
Yeah, but you got things like regular fresh baguettes and things like that.
Oh yeah. In the morning, we had good coffee, good bread, marmalade, butter. That was food was good. Can't complain.
Yeah, and did you do any further training in Berlin?
No, it was more technical training and gun practicing also. But these were the only 2 things, really. There was not much. I was disappointed. I wish that I'd been running every day, every morning, but no such thing at all.
The impression you're giving me is that discipline quite relaxed, or there just wasn't a lot, to do, really.
Yeah, well, it was relaxed in the way that we had our job to do, and then we hardly interfered with the professional soldiers who were more officers or petty officers, but we hardly talked to them. We hardly had any contact. We had our part of the barracks with all, code things to open most doors, and often it was the same code. It was suspected that it was the original code, that they never bothered to change it because they were not very savvy in general. That was the thing between the servicemen and the professionals, that they were not very bright. It was just a job. They were not very well educated. It was, but no interference really. So they were not, because the job we were doing was taking place in offices. We were not really, we didn't have much. We never saluted each other. Giving the salute in France. If you don't have a hat on your head, which we never did in the offices, you can't salute with a regular salute. So you have to just nod your head when it's an officer, the captain comes in, you just stop speaking. But otherwise, discipline was pretty lax.
Right. Was there anything on your uniform that indicated that you worked in the signals intelligence, or was it just a general uniform you had?
No, it was a general uniform. The only thing that we had is that we had a special card to go and eat. So we wouldn't wait in line because we were presumably opérationnel. So we were presumably busy. We couldn't wait. So, but otherwise, it would just say that we were this, and everybody could see there was an antenna, and it was called electronic warfare. But so some people asked us, "What do you do?" So I said, I can't tell you, because then I have to kill you. But anyway, so there was nothing really, except that they knew if we were from that section, that's what we were doing.
So what did you do in your leisure time? And I mean, you told me you met this German woman. What did you do? You went out dancing, cinema, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, more like cinema or restaurant or her home, because obviously there was no way she could come to our home. That was strictly forbidden. I think it's only once that we saw a woman. It was the French girlfriend of one of these guys, and she came in with a uniform. And then, we were very impressed that he could bring her inside. But anyway, so just to go back to Brigitte, who was that German woman. It was, either her place and movie theaters, restaurant. It was really, looking back, it was fun. I was lucky. After I had to go back. Then she came to Paris for a while, but then it just probably wouldn't have worked. It was probably the end of the love story, and I'm not even sure that she was serious. She was a little older than me. She was 27. And she was married, but she was divorcing. Her husband wanted to work he was offered a good job in West Germany. And that's the thing. She did not want to leave Berlin because she was a Berliner. And she thought that, she couldn't live in West Germany. But then she told me about her husband, that he was a champion in karate. So I said, "Whoa, gee, you make sure that you let me know when he's visiting Berlin."
Yeah.
Don't want to meet him. But in any case, they were divorcing.
And how did the locals treat you? Did they? I mean, it sounded like you said earlier that they treated you with respect and were quite pleased to have soldiers in Berlin to defend them from the Warsaw Pact.
Right. I think they were very grateful to the Allies for the blockade, but as a general rule, they were pretty much embarrassed about World War I and II, but especially II. But they were very friendly. This is Prussia. Berlin is Prussia. And they're very welcoming, very open, very friendly people to French people, especially. I think they love French people. I'm not sure it's true in return, but it's not disliked toward Germany, the German people. But it's true that the Germans really like France.
I generally get the impression that Berlin, certainly for the British Army, Berlin was one of the best postings you could have because you were really well looked after, free transport, a great city to be living in. Would you say that was the same for the French Army, that it was a very sought after posting? People wanted to, if there was somewhere they were going to get sent, they'd prefer it as Berlin than anywhere else. Yeah,
I don't know. We all were happy to be in Berlin, but on the other hand, it was far from home. You had to travel night. I'm not sure why, but we would take a night train, and then there was no sleeper, not a sleeper type of train. So you arrive in Paris, you're exhausted, and I went back 2 times, I think, for the whole time I was there. So that was kind of far. Not that I missed home much, anyways. Maybe I missed the city of Paris, but all in all, I think that most other people wanted to be close to home. Spend a weekend there, or go back home every other week. But that was not really possible in Berlin.
So the way you traveled to Berlin was by train every time. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. It was a night train. It was like 8 hours, even though could be much faster. But then, you had to cross the border, and these guys would just check the train. They had mirrors and check under the train, etc. And it was just you would waste just a whole hour just being just crossing that border and crossing it again. Entering West Germany, where they would check if nobody jumped in the train to escape to West Germany. The other way around was highly unlikely that people escaped to East Germany, but they certainly checked.
You mentioned some interaction with US soldiers at the PX store at Tempelhof. Did you have much contact with British soldiers?
Hardly any. The only place we saw them were in that, target practicing, every month or every other month, but hardly got a chance to really, talk to them. It was unfortunate because, I thought that it would have been interesting, but the level, my English really was bad in these days. It was more like, high school English. My German got much better after a little while, but, chit-chatting with British soldiers, except, for the basic things. And they were also professional soldiers. So that was also another big gap. Like, we had a hard time dealing with professional soldiers in the French army. So we perceived them as the same kind of people that, just joined the army, as opposed to us who were forced to join it for our service time.
Did you ever visit East Berlin?
Yes, in fact, that was fun. Yeah, we had a bus. You had to wear the uniform there, and no way to talk to any local people. No way. But then you would be, 15 of us going to a museum, going to big, places that tourists visit. And I remember being there once, and it was cold, and I put my hands in my pockets, and of course behind me was one of these sergeants who just started screaming at me, using the F word for every, the French F word for every other second, telling me, how can you do that? You're in a foreign country. You're supposed to look like a serious and like a French soldier, and then you put your hands in your pocket. And I thought again that I was going to be in big trouble while going back to the barracks, but nothing happened again. So it was pretty low level, the discipline. It was, plus it was paperwork for that guy, so he was not, not a motivated person, so nothing ever happened. But yeah, East Berlin was a totally different world. It was not, there was no ruins that you wouldn't see, in the 70s. It was history, but then they had rebuilt it. They were probably behind. The housing didn't look, as wealthy as they did in the West. But again, talking to a local guy, even though most of us could speak German at that point, it was not even, and they would fear you. They would look like, check you wearing a uniform, then look the other way.
And what places did you see in East Berlin?
We went to the museum. Where I can't remember the name of it. Otherwise it was just 4 hours at most, maybe more like 3 hours. It was a very short thing. And you had to apply for it. Most people didn't really care, which was unfortunate. But
did you see the East German honor guard at the Neue Wache? Did you see that?
Oh yeah. That was the kind of thing. Also, and these were servicemen. I don't know if those who were doing that special Wache were. They were probably just average NVA soldiers,
Yeah, I think they were defined as being in quite elite units of the East German army to carry out that guard.
Even though, on the miradors, on the, how do you call these, the watchtowers that they had all around Berlin, sometimes we were told they were regular soldiers and that they made sure they didn't know one another. So there was some doubt if the other guy was not a snitch, but that was the idea. It was that they were servicemen, not always sure if they were going to be able to shoot when told, but feared one another. But we, never got anywhere near these guys. But we were told that. I don't know if it's true.
Mm. And did you see much of the border elsewhere in Berlin?
It's big in the end. I think you even have cows in my days. There were some entire areas near Wannsee, with these little lakes. You had the big open space, but I tended to spend most of my time in the populated cities. Or with my friends, almost every other day we would go out and try, and drink some beer or wine with local people. We had quite a few interesting discussions with some of these guys. The young, there were all sorts of cafes in Berlin, but then you had coffees with, for just like in England, you have coffees, pubs for working class, for all different areas. And, we would look for cafes where you had young people, especially young women, but, women don't tend to go out in cafes or discos as easily as men. But we could meet quite a few Germans, and my German got better after a while, but it was, they were, friendly people.
Yeah, when you say interesting conversations, what sort of things were you talking about? Can you remember?
Yeah, it was often political, mind you, that, as opposed to maybe, in America, you hardly, especially after Trump or in the days of Trump, you don't even talk about politics. But in general, Europeans tend to talk about that or history, about World War II. We would try to, and most of them knew a lot and would would discuss, some, and strangely enough, there were also a lot of East Germans that had crossed the border in some exchange programs because they were too left-wing or too right-wing, whatever. But then they had some programs, and each time I would find out that one guy was from the East, a young man, and then I would get scared and try to make sure that I had as little to do with him. But otherwise, yeah, political discussions were not unusual at all.
Yeah, because in West Berlin, you couldn't be conscripted into the West German army. So you did have a lot of young men who would live in West Berlin to avoid being conscripted into the army.
Yeah, that's true. I remember that. That's their way to bring young people to Berlin. That there are a few universities, Freie Universität, and still today they're desperately trying to appeal to young Germans, and I'm not sure if they're successful, but the rents are pretty low, and that attracts also.
Yeah, I think the rents are going up quite quickly, actually. And I think the reason why you couldn't get conscripted was because Berlin was still officially occupied by the Allied powers and wasn't technically part of West Germany.
That's right. No, I had forgotten that, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, if you came to West Berlin, you could get away with service. Yeah, that's true. That's 50 years ago.
I'm really sort of trying to excavate some memories from the deepest recesses of your memory. When did you leave Berlin?
Well, I left in 73, I think, after a year and a half altogether. But then some of it was not part of the service. It was only 1 year. But then I left for France and then started, trying to go back to school, then tried to make some money and go and travel with the savings. So I did that. I worked for a year or two in Paris, and then made enough money to travel for several years after. And then, when I was in my 20s, then I went back to school, and then my late 20s, went back to school, studied political science, and even though I never got a job in political science, turned out to be a waste of time. But I was just fascinated by this whole Cold War things. It's unbelievable.
Were there any unusual or particularly interesting situations that you had in Berlin?
Well, the only interesting situation about the work itself was when there was the war between Israel and the some Arab countries, Egypt and Syria, that was unbelievably busy. We could see that the Warsaw Pact were just confusing us. What we would do to catch some unusual frequency, it was done kind of manually, and then the guy would just start a tape recorder, and then when there was that unrest in the Soviet side, then the amount of messages was so high that even if you had a scanner, like I suspect Americans had some scanning device that would just detect the frequency and start a tape recorder immediately, then they were totally swamped. And I suspect that's why they started putting some nonsense messages. I remember one of these messages that was interesting during that war in the Middle East, where it was a German guy in the East German army who wrote that message that was saying, "He who reads that message has to be a moron." So of course it was made for us, knowing that we listen to them, and then they know that we listen to to them, and we also know that they know that we know that, in the end, it's so ridiculous. It makes no sense to invest money. But, our job was just to look at what to expect, etc. But then that message was very interesting because you did not know if it was a code, really, if it was something to keep or not. It was among many others that we caught, and I don't know how many, the Brits or the American could catch also. And then, it's what is a real message? What is it talking about? Most of the time, they talk about the weather report, but in these days where they send bogus messages in the air, then anything could mean anything, and
So these messages that were being listened into weren't encrypted; they were in clear language.
Yeah, the Germans would say, it was an alphanumeric thing, so they would just not say he who reads this message in pure German. It was just letter by letter, like a telex. It was like, we have Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, blah, blah, blah. And they have their own code in the Warsaw Pact. So it was just letter and numbers. It's after you get one guy who reads it that you get access to a clear version. But what they would say on the waves was just alphanumeric. You had no idea if...
Right, so not encrypted in any way, aside from using a phonetic alphabet to communicate.
Right, and the message itself on FM could not be encoded. Well, today, if you can encode your voice, you can encode a lot of things, but in these days, it was pretty basic.
And what was this intelligence being shared with the British and the Americans?
This I have no idea. You could try to ask. The answer was always, that's none of your business. But I had no idea, really. That's a good question, though. You wish that everything was shared, but not always. And there was that, a lot of things would happen between the Brits and the Americans that we were not aware of. And the Germans were not aware of, when they would discover a tunnel like this they did. I forgot the name. It was called Gold, tunnel under Berlin. It was in the 50s, I think, or 60s. But
50s.
The Germans learned about it through the Russians, who just complained about it. But the French and the Germans, I think they were not really part of the...
Well, the French had left NATO, the direct command of NATO, hadn't they, in was it early 70s?
I think it was under de Gaulle, so that was in the 60s.
60s, right, okay.
Early 60s,
yeah. So the French were detached anyway from the main command structures of NATO.
Yeah, that's correct. So there was probably not much that we had to share. We probably would have learned from you guys, especially, England tends to be more militarily tied to the US. Even the NSA stuff in Britain are not made to necessarily to listen to the enemy, but for the Brits to listen to Brits, and then for the Americans to listen to their friends. But it's true that all these NASA network, France or Germany, are not involved very much. It's almost like a different, separated world, which, for the better, for the worse.
And we have further information such as videos and links in our show notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Now, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast without the generous support of our patrons. However, I want to especially thank our Politburo level members who are contributing a generous $30 a month to keep us on the air. They are Tony Sowards, Sam Hardwick, Nicholas Butter, Jeffrey Jones, Matthew Comstock, Frederick Esposito, Jack Madwed, Todd Lemieux, Mark Labance, and Peter Ryan. Don't forget, if you like one of those Cold War Conversations coasters and help support the show, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If you can't wait for the next episode, please visit our Facebook discussion group where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.